Welcome, everyone. Good morning to those of you on the US East Coast. Good afternoon and evening to others joining us from overseas, as the case may be. We'd like to welcome you to the webcast on Perspectives on Education and Resilience, hosted by USAID's Education in Crisis and Conflict Network. My name is Jim Rogan, and I serve as the Crisis and Conflict Specialist on the ECCN support team, where I also lead the resilience activity area, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's talk. We're excited about today's discussion, which addresses a topic of great interest, and we're very fortunate to be joined by a panel of experts who have been working at the cutting edge of resilience and education. Today's webcast serves as a launch of USAID's new Resilience and Education White Paper, which was commissioned by USAID through ECCN. This paper is not yet public, so today you'll be given some early insights into its findings. Today's recording and the white paper both will be ready next week on the ECCN website. Now, if I may, let me briefly introduce our panel of expert speakers. Christine Gottschalk is director of USAID's Center for Resilience, where she oversees the agency's strategy and approach to building the resilience of vulnerable communities and areas subject to recurrent crisis. Her technical expertise includes humanitarian assistance and crisis response, post-conflict peace building, and reconstruction and food security. Dr. Ritesh Shah is senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. He is a global scholar and expert on education provision in contexts affected by crisis and conflict, and he is the author of the forthcoming USAID Resilience and Education White Paper. He has published widely in this area. No doubt many of you are familiar with his work. Joel Reyes is a senior institutional development specialist with the World Bank. He has 25 years of experience with the bank, where he led the design of the Education Resilience Approaches, or ERA, within the System Assessment for Better Education Results Program, or SABER. Many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with his work as well. Finally, Anjali Shivshankar serves as the Education in Crisis and Conflict Senior Research and Learning Advisor within USAID's Office of Education. Anjali is the team's focal point on resilience, and she guided the development of the white paper. We have approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes specifically devoted to presentations. Each speaker will have roughly 10 minutes, and we will listen to all 4 presentations and then allow for approximately 15 minutes for Q&A. We will select questions from those that came in during the webcast, and as time allows, we will be answering questions that were submitted as part of the registration process. We will try to find a way to answer those questions that have come in that we are not able to address during the recording, so stay tuned for the ECCN website for further information on this. So without any further welcome, I'm going to turn now to our first speaker, Christine Gottschalk. So Christine, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you, Jim. I'm going to start today by just providing a few framing remarks for the discussion on how USAID is approaching resilience. First, resilience really is being elevated within the agency as a priority within our agency's redesign, and resilience is seen as critically linked to the journey to self-reliance. Without resilience, it's hard to see how countries can progress on that journey. Our resilience efforts are still relatively new. They are definitely a work in progress, but they are already demonstrating very clear dividends. We are also expanding our portfolio of countries where we're really focused on building resilience to recurrent and protracted crises. We had been focused on about 7 countries, and we've just increased that to 13. And lastly, the role of measurement and learning and analytics has been really critical to our understanding of resilience and what that means for improving programming and our approach. And this white paper is another important piece of building that evidence. here are our current set of resilience-focused countries within USAID. I put this up to note the importance of the number of countries that are in conflict or crisis that we are focused on. And again, the insights from this white paper are very important to our learning. And resilience really is simply the ability to manage through adversity and change without compromising future well-being. USAID is a big bureaucracy, so of course we have a much longer definition. I think this longer definition is important because it shows the holistic approach that is needed to address these complex uh, um, environments. And then the impetus and rationale for USAID for really focusing on resilience is threefold. One, it is just the high cost in lives and livelihoods of going back to the same places over and over again with humanitarian assistance. We find for our partner countries, the rationale for really shifting their focus often is learning just how the high cost to their own national and regional economies. And then, of course, a third rationale is just the high cost to the US government taxpayer as well. And we do find that an ounce of prevention truly is worth a pound of cure. For every dollar invested in longer term resilience strengthening, we do reduce threefold the need for humanitarian assistance and avoided losses. So, what's different? The main difference is that we really are looking at shocks and stresses as perennial features, not just anomalies. But we're doing joint planning and analysis to address these. The other key difference I want to highlight is that we've flipped from a focus on vulnerability to a focus on capacity, to a focus on assets, abilities, and agency. And you'll hear from some of the other speakers today the strong importance of thinking about some of these concepts that transcend sectors, such as aspirations, social cohesion. And then in USAID, we see three main sources of resilience. I'm going to go very quickly through these because the other speaker is going to speak to them. But one is resilient livelihoods. A second is resilient systems and institutions. And important to today's discussion is resilient people. We need a healthy, well-nourished, educated population that's able to pursue resilient livelihoods, that are empowered, have aspiration, and have the confidence and sense of agency to pursue those to pursue livelihoods. And then I noted up front that we are seeing that our resilience efforts are beginning to pay real dividends. This is a very recent finding from the arid and semi-arid regions of Kenya, where many people thought years ago that we couldn't bring development assistance. And we've seen a very substantial reduction in poverty. And equally important, we've seen a tremendous increase in people's own perception of their resilience to shocks. And I'm going to turn over now to Ritesh, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the findings from this white paper. But as you'll see on some of the things where we really feel we need to continue our learning, this white paper and the work of USAID's Education and Conflict and Crisis team is really essential to continuing to inform our programming. Ritesh, over to you.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks for that introduction into the thinking and work of USAID more broadly on resilience and resilience. What I want to do now is to kind of zoom in and look at what are the implications of that for the education sector. And that was really the remit of the white paper. The white paper starts out by exploring in some detail what is that relationship which exists between education and resilience. So one side of the equation is understanding how can and what are the myriad of ways in which education contributes to resilience at different levels. Um, as as which is signaled by Christine, one of the key issues is around social assets and social networks. And what we know from emerging research in the education sector is that, first of all, education has an important role to play in terms of building higher levels of trust in others, an increased willingness to join social institutions and organizations outside the family and community. But we also know that when education is provisioned in a way that's equitable and transparent, it has a really important role to play in strengthening bonds between communities and between individuals, communities, and the states. What we call horizontal and vertical social cohesion. And these networks are quite critical, as wider resilience research has found, in supporting all levels of the system to withstand the impacts of shocks and stresses. Beyond that, particularly though within the work that's been done in the DRR space, we know that education plays a critical role in strengthening knowledge towards responding to natural disasters, climate change, health emergencies, and future armed conflict. This knowledge is an important precursor for changing behaviors that can act to adapt or transform context of adversity. And again, we have evidence that's showing this to be the case. We know as well that education can improve women's empowerment and gender equality. For example, we know education, particularly secondary education, increases the ability of women to make more informed choices about their lives, and particularly over matters such as marriage and reproduction. And from a livelihood perspective, we know that education helps women to use information and services and diversify their opportunities they have. Probably the argument that's been used the most to date, and which I'll just quickly review as well, is that we know that education is an important contributor to strengthening human capital, particularly for those with secondary level education and beyond. The evidence shows that they are better able to adapt to or transform behaviors and livelihoods in anticipation of or in response to adversity, because the fact they have higher capital assets, better earnings, improved productivity, and greater opportunities for paid employment. Lastly, we know that education has a really important role to play in what Christine was just talking about in terms of agency. And it again, we have strong evidence that's emerging now that shows the role of education in strengthening aspects like aspirations, self-efficacy, and confidence. And this has an impact on reducing the likelihood of negative coping strategies during a time of adversity. On the flip side, in addition to that, though, there are particular qualities of education that we argue in the white paper render it an important sector for thinking about resilience strengthening efforts. And you can see those 3 points raised up there on the graphic. But the other point to raise here, and this is a point that's made in the white paper, is that education can't do it alone. And an education system is part of wider structures and systems. And so what that means is that there needs to be a sense of wider capacities, networks, resources, assets that are embedded within the system itself. And so we need to think about what might some of those actions, structures, relationship networks, and processes be. And there's some examples given in the graphic here. When the two work together, and this is the argument the white paper makes, is when we feel that education can work constructively to reduce chronic vulnerability and facilitate inclusive growth, which is the long-term ambition of any resilience strengthening effort. Beyond that, then, the questions are, well, then what does that look like? What does that mean in terms of implications for programming? So we developed in the white paper a conceptual framework, and it starts with an understanding that in the all context, as Christine mentioned, that USAID is operating, there are a range of shocks and stressors that are impacting on education programs at all times. What we also stress, though, is that these shocks and stressors, and there are examples of this given here on the graphic, and there are further examples given in the white paper. The exposure, the level of exposure, and the level of sensitivity that different levels of the system have, and within that particular communities, schools, or learners have, is impacted by what we call capacities. And Christine started to touch on those in her presentation. What I tried to do in the white paper was to think about what might those capacities be, and at what levels do they exist, and what are some examples of those that we know that education contributes to. Now, in this graphic here, you can see that there are some examples given of the differences between capacities that are about absorption, adaptation, and transformation. Ultimately, and this is a strong point that the white paper makes, the long-term ambition isn't just to absorb or even necessarily to just adapt, but to strive towards transforming and ultimately reducing the underlying risk factors. And that requires thinking about those actions that are listed at the top of this diagram. When we see that resilience, when these resilience capacities work together, because we also know that we can't rely on absorptive capacity alone at the level of learners to help the system or even communities to withstand shocks and stressors, that it needs to be aligned and working together. And when they do, we feel, and it's argued in the white paper, that it leads towards a resilience pathway. When it doesn't, however, it can lead to what we notice as a vulnerability pathway. Now, that has a direct impact on education sector outcomes. So when the system works and when these capacities work together to mitigate and work against reduce the levels of sensitivity that the system has, it can work to ensure that sector outcomes are not compromised. So to conclude then, the white paper talks about what does this mean moving forward in terms of thinking about sector programming. And to do so, the white paper proposes that programs need to be asking the following question. The first question is resilience to what? What are when we think about resilience, we need to first understand what are the risk factors, what are those shocks and stressors that are impacting on the education system. We need to identify those, and that can be done through instruments which have been developed within the USAID education portfolio, like the RERA, which Anjali will also touch on. We also then, once we know what the impact of shocks and stressors are, we need to understand how does it currently impact on different levels of the education system. How is the system currently responding to those shocks and stressors? What we want to do through those efforts, though, is not necessarily to find out where the vulnerabilities are, but also to find out where the existing assets exist to help to mitigate against the worst impacts of those shocks and stressors. And it's really about identifying those assets, those networks, those structures that are inherent in the system already to work from and to build on. So it works from a strengths-based approach rather than a deficit approach. Thinking about that then, it's about asking resilience through what? How can resilience further be strengthened? And that's about thinking through, if there are really strong capacities, for example, at one level of the system, how can they be catalyzed and leveraged on to be working more in sync with the other levels of the education system? So what are those capacities? And at what level do they need to be do they need to be strengthened, and through what types of actions? And that then leads to the last question, which is resilience of what? To what end? if programming is to be done with a resilience standpoint or a resilience frame, what is the purpose of those efforts? Is it purely about resilient learners, which is not actually what the guidance from USAID's resilience programming suggests, nor is it what what is recommended. The white paper highlights shouldn't be the focus either. The argument that the white paper puts forth is we need to be thinking about resilient education systems that are contributing to broader reductions in chronic vulnerability and inclusive growth. And that requires rethinking a narrow focus on resilience at a specific level or with particular populations and thinking about the interactions. In terms then of the program cycle, what this means is that there need to be opportunities for learning, for reflection, for evidence gathering, not just on what is the impact of these efforts, but how is resilience functioning? How is resilience understood through both objective measures and also through what we call subjective measures? And this is what the white paper advocates for in terms of thinking about learning and research as part of the next step forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Yoel now, who's going to talk about the work that the World Bank's been doing.
Thank you, Ritesh, and thank you again for inviting me to participate in this interesting webinar. In the 10 minutes I have, I really want to quickly give an overview of what we've learned so far in the development of the Education Resilience Approaches program that started more or less in 2012 and 2013. The impetus actually for this work was the World Bank recognizing that as a development agency, we were starting in a new field, humanitarian field, and we were trying to understand first what was the role, what were the needs in terms of education in those contexts, and then what was the role of a development agency like the World Bank. My team actually first started focusing on understanding and liaising with the resilience research community. Resilience actually has been studied for the past 50 years. And actually, there was a lot of work already being done by experts in this area that we wanted to learn from. So what I want to share with you actually is through this process, what are some of the misconceptions about resilience that we began to clarify? What has been the value added for a development institution working in what we call fragile, conflict, and violence affected contexts? And where are we going from now? What is needed in terms of both knowledge and policy as well as practice? Really quickly, we found 3 areas of misconception and sometimes criticism about using resilience as a framework. And the first one was actually what we all heard about resilience just being another buzzword, that comes and goes into the work that is being done both in humanitarian and development contexts. I think what we found through our engagement, our dialogue, going deep into the research that has been done over the past 50 years, is that actually resilience is a field of study. It's not a buzzword. It's grounded on 50 years of empirical evidence across different fields. Of course, on human development, children and youth development, there's been a lot of work since the 70s, but also more recently in neurology, community psychology, change management, and organizational development. So we felt comfortable actually that the evidence was there, that there was a process that needed to be understood in terms of how people, their communities and organizations recover, function, and even positively improve in context of adversity. Of course, the emphasis is always, and we tend to concentrate on personal resilience just because there's been a lot written about that. So there was a criticism and a misconception that resilience was mostly about individualistic approaches. But there's been a lot of work also on the more social ecological emphasis on resilience. And actually, researchers like Michael Unger actually have done very serious multicultural and international studies that show that you cannot separate individual resilience, such as areas of empowerment, hope, strength, without collective support of communities and without services provided by institutions. So the emphasis, as is well presented here, is on the social ecology of resilience. There was also some criticism that resilience actually could yield an emphasis on letting vulnerable people cope with adversity, cope with difficult situations, and that there was actually no real effort to help change the circumstances that have brought up the adversity. There's work also that was done, and it's something that we've been trying to address as well in terms of looking at issues of social justice and recognizing that there are forces in society, in institutions, in groups that can silence voice, that can limit empowerment, that can prevent organizing and advocacy. And if we really believe on resilience as a guiding framework for development, then we need to both identify where the sources of injustice are, and then also think about what are the interventions that can actually provide the contextual forces for resilience to take place at the individual and community and structural levels. And lastly, and this actually led us to, there's a lot of discussion on transformation and actually not just changing and hoping individuals and communities recover and function in spite of adversity, but actually how do we change adversity? How do we change protracted problems? And context. And this brings us actually to start discussing issues of how resilience affects both institutions and culture, which are the two social entities that sustain either positive change or bring us back to the context of adversity. Really quickly, just to say that for the World Bank, actually resilience has been able to help us merge or integrate more a view of both the humanitarian and development views, closing that gap by at least 4 ways. Actually allow us to identify education outcomes that go beyond our traditional focus of access, learning, equity, and completion. And we're bringing then also outcomes that we would like to support and actually monitor and see how they are integrated in terms of protection and well-being. Ritesh mentioned the focus on assets amid adversity. So this strength focus is very important. We continue to do our risk assessments, but these risk assessments also need to identify what are those assets that can be useful to build resilience at different levels. And most importantly for us is not only identifying the resilient child or the resilient school, but what is the process? How and why these children in these schools that show better than expected outcomes, how did they achieve that? And that brings us actually to also understand maladaptive coping. Maybe other children and other schools tried also to be resilient, but this is where more critical analysis comes in and trying to see maybe some dysfunctional practices and injustice that have prevented that from happening. Lastly, where we are now is precisely on this more complex issue. If resilience actually is about a social ecology, it's about not just helping individuals and communities to be more resilient, but actually on changing the context of adversity, then how is that done? And we started to work, and actually this is also at the personal level in my own research, trying to define what that transformative resilience is all about. I think what we know is, and it was mentioned before, that we are after agency and empowered at the personal level of students, teachers, principals, parents, that we want to improve communities, school communities, neighborhoods, and that we want changes At the institutional level, we want better services from the ministries of education in our case, more commitment. But I think what we are finding out, and I'm doing it in my own research, is that the important part is the connection. Is empower agents, individuals, students, teachers need to participate in the improvement of their community. And there are examples of communities, schools that are improved, but also communities that are improved because of the support of students, teachers, and parents. That those improved and better communities need to organize and need to advocate for better institutional and cultural change. So this is something that I think us development agencies in education, we do need to start learning more about advocacy, how groups influence institutional change, social change, and connect that to our understanding of education contributions. Uh, I I'm ending with this slide, which actually was the Education Resilience Approaches Framework that we created back in 2012, 2013. It hasn't changed, but I leave it here because, as you see, even with this conceptual framework, what it tells us is we need to go deeper and deeper to understand really what the causal and change mechanisms are. And even when we have a logical view of where we headed, I think we learn as we go in terms of these very complex processes. Thank you. I now pass to Anjali, who's going to talk more about the relevance of resilience for USAID. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Yuel. So at USAID, we released an education policy, and about half of our education investments are spent in a country that is affected by conflict and crisis. And in many cases, as Christine noted, these are complex crises with conflict layered on natural disasters, climate change, struggling economies. And these are not anomalies anymore. These are things that will endure, that will recur. So when we think about the vision and the purpose that USAID's education policy sets out, that education systems, not external actors, but the systems themselves can ultimately support learners from pre-primary to higher education, and that USAID's education programming contributes to sustained, measurable improvements in learning outcomes, we have to program from a resilience perspective. And as Ritesh took us through the key conceptual components of the white paper, what the white paper does is lay out our initial technical framework, potential program design tools, and the business case for thinking about resilience in education. This, of course, builds on work that the Education and Conflict and Crisis Network has been doing, led by Jim and others over the past 5 years, particularly the Rapid Education and Risk Analysis Toolkit, the Safe Learning Environments Toolkit, and also links into the work that the INEE has been doing on conflict-sensitive education. So, that said, even though it is a newer area of focus for us articulated in this way at USAID, it is building on our previous work, but we do have learning to do to help inform future best practices, future programming, and continue to build the evidence base. So the Education and Conflict and Crisis team does have a learning agenda that tracks along these 5 priorities, and resilience focuses is an explicit focus of 4 of these areas: humanitarian development coherence, student well-being, which does include social and emotional well-being, local and institutional capacity development, and data monitoring and evaluation. And a couple of the questions that we have outlined that are of interest to us are the following. So for the first one, in humanitarian development coherence, education is not the only actor in humanitarian spaces. In thinking about the list of countries that Christine showed us, if we think about a country like Ethiopia, there are development actors there, there are humanitarian actors there, and education programs have been there for a significant number of years. So we want to be able to articulate from the education perspective, how are our education programs both improving education outcomes in terms of equitable, safe, quality education, in terms of learning outcomes, but also how is education programming contributing to other types of resilience outcomes? That could be from the food security sector, that could be from the health sector, that could be from the governance sector. In the second set of questions, when we're talking about student well-being, a question we have on our minds is, how does individual resilience in the form of social and emotional skills support the success of learners and teachers? And this could be self-efficacy, this could be self-esteem, this could be self-concept. And we're really curious to understand essentially what Christine had highlighted as a frontier of research, which is how do some of these individual skills contribute to resilience up the chain. In terms of local and institutional capacity development, as Ritesh said, and as you well highlighted, let me go back. We're interested in understanding how we can contribute to building a more resilient education institution. So in line with our policy vision, not just how can these individual students for now in a conflict and crisis affected environment stay in school a couple more months, learn a little bit more. We really want to know how can this education system, knowing that they will be affected by conflict and crisis again, how can they maintain access to a quality, safe, equitable education? And then finally, looking at data monitoring and evaluation, what are the best indicators, tools, methods to capture both what resilience looks like at all levels of the education system, but also how do we capture the impacts? So in thinking about what's next for USAID, as Christine said, we do have a new list of resilience-focused countries, or an expanded list of resilience-focused countries. Almost all of these places do have large education portfolios. So what we're hoping to do is work with missions and partners to translate the concepts of the white paper into the USAID program cycle, from strategy all the way down to implementation. We also want to get better at measurement. I think in particular, one of the key challenges that we'll face is that in education programming, we're very used to measuring our outcomes, whether they're participation or learning, on an annual basis, maybe a semi-annual basis. Something that I have definitely taken from the resilience sector is that whatever the shocks and stresses are, whatever the resilience capacities are, we need to time our measurement with those elements, not only the education calendar. And then finally, invest in research and learning that helps better articulate this role of education programming in supporting other types of resilience outcomes that are important to the agency, and vice versa. I think up until now, we focused a lot on the role of education in promoting human capital, but I think both as Ritesh and Yoel laid out for us, education programming has a far-reaching potential for impact, and we really need to start documenting that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim to take us through Q&A.
Thank you very much to everyone for extremely interesting presentations. I'm looking at the time. We have approximately, generously, perhaps 20 minutes for questions. And I have a number of questions that I will refer to that came in from the registration process. And just to remind everyone, you have the possibility of asking questions right now live on the lower part of your screen, the lower banner. There's a Q&A mechanism. You can ask us questions right now. Bearing in mind, we'll probably be able to field several right now. So with that, I will ask Christine to answer the first question that came in that relates to measurement. And the question was, how do you measure resilience and find evidence of a causal relationship between education and resilience? And there was a related question that concerns tools that can do this, but perhaps let's first tackle just the general question of measurement. Christine, is that okay? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and one we could probably dedicate a series of webinars to. So I'm going to give a short answer. In the USAID Center for Resilience, we've really focused our measurement approach on measuring the capacities that are essential to strengthening resilience. And Ritesh spoke a little bit about some of those capacities. And that does also include some of the things that transcend sectors that all the speakers today have referred to: empowerment, social cohesion, sense of agency, and aspiration. And then in the this is a really important topic, and we have a 6-part guidance note series that you can access through the resource links at the end of this webinar. And I'm going to see if Anjali wants to provide any remarks in terms of the education lens on measurement.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And I think in terms of the measurement, I would echo or emphasize what Christine said, is that it's really important. And what we're really encouraging people in the education sector to do is use tools like the rapid education and risk analysis to identify what are the resilience capacities, what are the risks that you're seeing in this particular environment. The tool that you'll use to measure that is going to vary based on what exactly you're trying to measure. I do think that in the education sector, we have a big opportunity, particularly within USAID missions, to make sure that we're leveraging surveys that are put out to the field. Things like food security surveys, things like the mix, things like DHS. I think we could also leverage that as a donor a little bit better to capture some basic information about education from a resilience perspective that we're not currently doing. And I think in terms of methods, Jim, which is the other part of your question, and establishing that causal link, the methods for establishing causal links is going to be similar for almost any sector, right? And so I would really encourage people to take a look at some of the resources and existing research that the Center for Resilience has commissioned, which has used things like propensity score matching, a difference in differences approach, in very dynamic environments with very mobile populations. So I think they've done an excellent job of demonstrating that it's totally possible to use the most rigorous methods possible to try and establish causal links between interventions that try and tackle the shocks and stresses to build a resilience capacity to affect some type of development outcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine and Anjali. I'm seeing a few more questions come in on our sort of live window here. There's a question about how to understand resilience in rural areas. The implication, I guess, being the difference between the urban and rural realities. Joel, can I steer this question to you and draw upon your long experience with the bank?
Sure, Jim. Well, maybe the question, I'm not a specialist in rural areas or rural development, but I think what we do know in resilience is that has to be context aligned. So what I would say is that part of what we need to do in terms of doing causal studies is not just studying what the impact of an intervention is or if it has had an impact, but trying to understand also what a particular outcome, resilience outcome that we want in, for example, a rural area. What are those social activities? What are those mechanisms? What are those assets and strengths actually that can help us achieve those outcomes? So, for example, we're thinking about resilience in education in rural areas. We first need to understand what the context of the difficulties of rurality in providing education services in those areas are. What are the impact, for example, in families, in their well-being, and then try to understand first what are the assets and the resources that exist in this particular context that then can be supported by education services and other types of services. Actually, in the ERA program, if you go to the resilience webpage, you will see that we have there's two case studies. One actually from Bhutan, which is actually focusing precisely on hard to reach rural communities, and the other one actually in El Salvador, focusing also on the difference in terms of violence affected communities, both in rural and urban areas.
Thank you, Joel. I'll turn to the next question, which is, and I'll be repeating these for everyone. Afghanistan was not on the list of USAID for education and resilience. Was there any reason? Will that be coming on the list soon? Presumably a relatively quick answer. Anjali, may I turn to you?
Yes, sure. And I would say So the list that Christine laid out for us are USAID's resilience-focused countries. In any country that is affected by conflict and crisis that has an education portfolio, the Office of Education does encourage missions and partners to use the concepts in this white paper to frame their strategy and their work. So just because a country is not on the list doesn't mean these concepts aren't valid and that we won't be working with missions and partners to support the implementation both of the learning questions that I laid out and also the technical frame that Ritesh presented.
Thank you, Anjali. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly because we have a large number of questions, a lot of interest from the wider audience here. There is a question about how to participate in, and I'm going to paraphrase, how can, and this is from Venezuela, how can people join active working groups or communities of practice on resilience and education? And I think that's a wider discussion, but my initial reaction would be first look to the ECCN website. There will be a transition happening to an EduLinks site under USAID. Our ECCN project is coming to a close, but I would say join the ECCN website as you can right now, and there you may find more resources and links to other communities of practice or working groups, as the case may be, for resilience and education. So online opportunities there. There are a few other questions, one or two I'd like to pull from those that came in during registration. And one relates to what does resilience look like at the individual level and the relationship to psychosocial services or social emotional learning. Anjali, may I turn to you to speak a little bit to the relationship between resilience and PSS and SEL, and maybe from that we can perhaps touch upon the individual level more broadly?
Yeah, definitely. And Ritesh and Christine do compliment me on this one. So when we think about the framework that Ritesh laid out for us, where it leverages the socio-ecological model, right, with the individual at the middle and then building out into the whole education system, social and emotional or soft skills are definitely a potential resilience capacity that we can either build or that may already exist. And the specific ones that we see so far in the literature are things like emotional engagement, self-awareness, self-esteem, self-confidence, um, empathy, and good social relationships, essentially. As we get farther up the chain from absorptive to adaptive capacities, we also see things like cognitive engagement, self-efficacy, again, sense of responsibility towards self and others, the ability to create social capital, and this, again, will obviously vary by age and stage of the learner that we're talking about. So the role of these types of skills in relationship to resilience depends on the ultimate outcome that you're talking about. So in the education space, our hypothesis is that learners and teachers with better social and emotional skills are more able to be successful at school despite the trauma that they're bringing with them into the classroom, and that having good social and emotional skills can also help them heal from that trauma. I think when we branch out into thinking about how those types of skills that education programs can in fact teach benefit other types of development outcomes, like in the food security space, in the health space, in the governance space, we're really eager to connect the dots there further, because that links back to this aspiration we have of demonstrating how education can contribute to other types of outcomes.
Thank you, Anjali. Ritesh, I recall a question coming in from during the registration process too that looked at or asked about whether, and this is to your message here on the sidebar, whether resilience is a singular idea or is it subjective. May I turn to you to discuss that topic of subjectivity of resilience, or is it a singular idea or subjective?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's come out of some of the work, the resilience research, particularly that of Chris Bennett and colleagues, is that we need to understand, when we talk about understanding resilience as a concept or measuring resilience as an outcome or a set of dispositions or behaviors, is that it's actually a subjective experience as much as it is an objective set of outcomes. So it touches on some of those things which Anjali just touched on, which are, agency, self-efficacy, perceptions of risk, aspirations. It's also about what people believe about their ability to handle future shocks and stressors. And that belief is going to impact the way that people, individuals, households, communities cope with, adapt to, or feel their ability to transform these underlying risk factors. This also affects the way that people see those networks, the relationships, what are the assets in their community, to what degree do they feel that the state will come to support them in a time of crisis. And these dimensions are equally important to understand as part of any conceptualization of resilience within a context. So I think while it's a bit of a tried and true saying, I think one of the key points that the white paper makes is that context actually matters quite a lot. And you can't come up with a universal definition of what resilience is or looks like across the globe.
Thank you, Ritesh. And while you were talking, a question came in that I think touches upon this topic that you were just addressing. The question is, if strengths or assets-based approaches become more prevalent, to what extent do indigenous conceptualizations of resilience inform programming? To what extent is this addressed in analysis and measurement tools? Would you add anything? I think you addressed this to a large extent. I'm just wanted to turn to you in case there was anything else you would add.
No, but I think understanding those conceptions from the populations is actually important. I know, for example, UL, I think, has done some recent work in Latin America, and I don't know if any of that work and engagement has touched on work with indigenous populations there and the way they understand these ideas. So I might pass it over to UL in case he has something to add here.
I think what is important to say is that although we've been mentioning and conceptualizing assets, empower, self-confidence, grit, those are just kind of the big buckets of what we know are areas that help individuals recover and function in adversity. But I think what we need to emphasize is that assets need to be identified in each context. Be a context, rural context, urban context, indigenous context. So the assessment of assets, we don't do it just once. We have to do it in the communities where we're going to work. And the second important point is this is where institutions come in. And what I've seen in some of our case studies is that although we have identified personal assets, school assets, we see a lot of changes, for example, in violence, in efforts to mitigate violence in schools in El Salvador. But the institutions haven't learned from those assets. Ministries of education have not learned from those assets actually to provide education services and other social services that sustain them or that allow to learn from them so other schools can do it. So when we're working in indigenous communities, the process needs to happen as well, identifying assets and seeing how institutions can support them.
Thanks, Joel. And Christine, may I also turn to you to draw on your broader experience from the Center for Resilience on the issue?
Yeah, I just wanted to add I agree with everyone else, and I just wanted to add a couple things. Within USAID, we really do strive to take a portfolio approach to strengthening resilience so that we are getting the intersection between different kinds of sector-based programs. So that means being very thoughtful about how we sequence, layer, and integrate cross-sectoral programming within a defined geography. And I also just wanted to note that when we are looking at our surveys to measure resilience, we are asking local communities how for their own concept of resilience and what resilience means to them, so that we are using their own language and concept in our surveys and information and data gathering.
Very good. Thank you, Christine. Let me turn to the next question that came up on the live board here. The question is, are there any plans for a broader and better coordination among donors, especially the World Bank, USAID, DFID, and EU, on promoting quality education and resilience? And how? Here, Anjali, may I turn to you?
Actually, I wanted to invite Christine to talk a little bit about donor coordination from the broader USAID perspective, just really to reemphasize what she's saying is that resilience is not something that only the education office is doing alone and is not something that we expect the education office to do in isolation at the mission level. So Christine, if you could give us your thoughts, that would be great.
Yeah, we are paying a lot of attention to how we improve donor coordination. And just going back to evidence base again, as we learn more and see what really is working on the ground, we are using that to inform our conversations with other donors and the wider stakeholder community, so that we can have more joined up efforts. I also we have also found, and I think this really links to USAID's emphasis on the journey to self-reliance, that key to success is having some political will and a way to organize and align donor efforts behind a country-driven plan. And countries are all at different levels of capacity, but whether it's the Sahel, whether it's the Horn of Africa, we really are aligning our efforts behind local efforts and working with other donors to make sure that we are all using to the greatest extent possible a similar approach.
Thank you, Christine. Anjali, would you want to add anything from the education side or leave it?
I think the other places that I would emphasize in addition to the journey or self-reliance is, again, humanitarian development coherence. So I think education, even though traditionally it's a very small percentage of humanitarian funds, in many places where we're spending humanitarian funds, there are, of course, existing education systems. So as Christine said, when I think USAID hopes to work with other donors to support the education systems that are there to really be resilient in the face of conflict and crisis. And I think the work that we do in service of that goal relates significantly to many donors' commitments to improve coherence across humanitarian development spectrum.
Can I just add that we have actually already been exchanging a lot of knowledge and also lessons learned. I would also recommend to look at the work that has been done in the Interagency of Education in Emergencies, INE, that we all participate. I am based now in Turkey, and for example, most countries, especially when there are contexts of adversity, we have a stakeholder group where we exchange also information and we coordinate our activities. And when I was based in Washington, even before, I know that we had some exchanges, conference, and very formal workshops where we met with USAID and we exchanged some information on some of these issues in education, especially in difficult contexts.
Thank you, Joel. I'm very much aware of time. We have 1 minute left, so we'll have to stop there in terms of responding to these very good questions. What I'd like to close with is just a note to say that we are putting up on your screen key resources on resilience broadly, as well as resilience and education, both from the Center for Resilience at USAID and the World Bank. And I wanted to also mention that you may be aware USAID's ECCN project is coming to a close next month after 5 years. We will have a closing event on October 8th in Washington, and there we also expect to have some very intensive discussions about resilience and education. If you have not already registered, please do. We'll be posting the registration link to our screen as well. Again, that's October 8th. And for the questions of where to obtain the white paper, look at the ECCN website for the about to be released Education and Resilience white paper. And we just want to thank you and thank our expert panelists and all of you in attendance. Thank you for the strong show of support and interest in the topic. Goodbye for now. Thank you again.